Just as Mahon and the Commission heard evidence over a period of 75 days, with the notes of this evidence exceeding more than 3,000 pages, and a final report extending to over 300, somewhat at odds with the Chief Investigator's original tome of just under 100 pages, inclusive of the attached appendices. The expectation with his appointment was that Mahon would be thorough, and in this regard he had most certainly not been found wanting. In addition to hearing evidence in Auckland, his quest for the truth had taken him to the US, Canada and Britain, interviewing experts and obtaining depositions from witnesses who were unable to attend New Zealand for the hearing. In total, 15 people had been interviewed overseas. He himself had visited Antarctica over a period of 3 days, from the 26th to the 29th of November 1980, where he had an opportunity to inspect all relevant areas of the terrain, including the crash site on the slopes of Mt.Erebus, and also the radio, radar and air traffic control facilities at McMurdo itself. Mahon, for his part, understood that in order to solve the mystery of 901 and explain why the accident had happened, 4 critical questions had to be answered. How had an experienced and well-trained crew apparently managed to fly their aircraft into the side of an active volcano some 11,000 feet below its summit? In so doing, why had they been apparently 27 miles to the east of their normal routing south, in an area where the potential threat of compromised terrain clearance was undoubtedly higher? Had the crew for some reason become lost or unsure of their whereabouts? Likewise, if the agreed stipulated rules of operation had said flights would not descend below 6,000 feet, and even at this altitude only in a defined area to the south of McMurdo, how had Collins and his crew managed to find themselves at 1,500 feet, travelling south but on a conflicting course to the geographic north of one of the continent's highest peaks? And why, with all this as stated fact, had nobody on board actually seen the mountain prior to impact? For surely if they had, their natural survival instinct would have triggered an appropriate reflex reaction, a reaction which conclusively had not taken place. Trying to get to the bottom of these questions was anything but simple and straightforward. Time and again, Mahon was frustrated with the approach adopted by Air New Zealand in the regulatory office, committing to an inquiry whose sole purpose was to establish the facts in an effort to mitigate the possibility of any future reoccurrence. As time progressed, Mahon instead believed more and more that there was a concerted effort on the part of these parties to obstruct and stonewall proceedings in an effort to deflect attention away from their involvement and to exonerate themselves from any possible suggestion of blame or liability. Both had been more than accepting of Chippendale's final report. Collins had been flying blind at low level, and as such, the resultant impact with the mountain was his fault, plain and simple. But for Mahon, the complexity of these questions deserved a more thorough investigation. Pointing the finger at Collins, he believed, was simplistic and fell far short of explaining all that had happened that fateful afternoon. It would do nothing other than highlight the traditional view of what had happened, without explaining the reasons why. And this concerned him greatly. Mahon's belief, having absorbed the testimony of all the relevant interested parties, was that the overriding issue contributing to the loss of the aircraft was the fundamental issue of the amended flight plan. The change of the final destination waypoint was accepted by all as an established statement of fact. However, where Chippendale believed that this was largely inconsequential, Mahon took an opposing viewpoint. In seeing it as largely irrelevant, Chippendale failed to thoroughly explain why the correction had been deemed necessary. Hewitt's testimony that the initial relocation of the destination waypoint was necessary in order to facilitate the instrument letdown procedure was understandable and completely legitimate. What transpired was that during their efforts to computerize the flight planning system about 18 months before the accident, supposedly the original and now defunct Williams Field position was adopted in error as the point to be transcribed into the computerized database, although an explanation for this erroneous selection was never established. Strange as this might be in isolation, during the process of moving the flight planning data from paper to computer, supposedly a further transposition error was made, shifting the waypoint inadvertently 2 degrees to the west. Air New Zealand's position was that these had been genuine errors which had supposedly remained hidden and unnoticed for a period of over 14 months. What raised Mahon's suspicion, however, was the fact that during this time frame geographical maps and charts began to appear which clearly depicted a route to Antarctica terminating at this supposedly erroneous end waypoint in the southernmost part of McMurdo Sound. Surely, Mahon believed, this was more than artistic license or mere coincidence. But to put the matter in context, had the shift of 2 degrees west actually been a deliberate act, so what? It would have depicted a route down the Sound following closely the established military route to Williamsfield, a safe and prudent distance west of the elevated terrain of Ross Island. In truth, it would have been a far more sensible approach to McMurdo than the one proposed by Air New Zealand, which would take flights directly over the summit of an active volcano. And therein the story would have ended. But sadly, this isn't what happened. On any given trip south to the Antarctic, flights would, during the latter stages of their approach to McMurdo, deviate visually from their filed route. Not only was there no prohibition from doing so, on the contrary, commanders were actively encouraged to. After all, the very reason for the presence in the area was to provide the best sightseeing experience possible. And it was for this reason that the repositioning of the destination waypoint 2 degrees west was never noticed. Crews simply never flew the full length of the route. That is, until Captain Simpson's flight, the penultimate flight to Antarctica that year. Circumstances on the day caused him to actually proceed all the way south to the filed destination waypoint at the foot of the Sound, and upon reaching the last point on the flight plan, he noted that it lay approximately 27 nautical miles west from the newly installed TACAN navigation beacon at Williamsfield. In his testimony to the Commission, Simpson stressed that he didn't interpret this as an error. Why should he? His pre-flight brief, he recalled, had prepared him for a flight down the full length of the Sound, so he believed he was where he was supposed to be, but nonetheless was of the opinion that the relative position and distance from the navigation beacon at Williamsfield was noteworthy and should be brought to the attention of following crews. Nothing more, nothing less. Significantly, he testified that this is exactly how he reported his observation to Air New Zealand Flight Operations Department, as just that, an observation. But it's here that the story of the shifting waypoints starts to become complicated. If Simpson's compelling testimony was to be believed, and indeed Mahon had, the Flight Operations Department of Air New Zealand were aware some weeks before the accident that the destination waypoint was indeed situated in the southernmost part of the Sound. Yet what frustrated and indeed angered Mahon was the fact that members of the department's management team had deliberately decided not to disclose this vital piece of information. Instead, the official company line, as articulated by Hewitt of the navigation section, was that the correction made on the morning of Collins' departure was simply to adjust the destination waypoint from where Hewitt assumed it to be, overhead the NDB, which had since been decommissioned, to overhead the newly installed TACAN navigation beacon, back on Williamsfield, a shift of merely 2.5 miles. Why this version of events was proposed by Air New Zealand was significant. Justifiably, a course correction of 2.5 miles most probably didn't require notification to the operating crew, but a course correction of 27 miles from the erroneous destination waypoint back to the TACAN most definitely would, particularly in light of the fact that such a major adjustment would now take the flight on a direct course towards Mt.Erebus, and failure to notify the crew of this fact would most probably be deemed as grossly negligent. In an effort to reinforce the company's position that they believed the flight plan change on the morning of Collins' departure was to be only minor in nature and largely insignificant, they attempted under cross-examination to convey a version of reality where all potential crews to McMurdo were briefed on the fact that their flights would pass directly overhead the volcano. However, time and again, DC-10 line pilots testified that this was most definitely not the impression they had taken away from their specific briefings. Indeed, with the exception of 1 or 2 management pilots, to a man, all testified that it was their explicit belief that approach to McMurdo would be down the wide, flat expanse of the Sound. Indeed, Colin's own children testified that on the night prior to the accident flight, their father had shown them the proposed route south on plotting charts he himself had created, a route which indeed proceeded down the Sound and not overhead Mt.Erebus. Mahon placed great emphasis on this fact, for it conclusively proved to him that Collins had a valid preconception that the incredibly accurate INS navigation system of his DC-10 would indeed steer him in this pre-programmed direction. Mahon's belief in Collins was thus absolute. Having listened to the various versions of events, he was of the opinion that Collins and his crew most definitely expected to approach McMurdo, having flown down the full length of McMurdo Sound. Chippendale, in contrast, had previously stated that irrespective of the waypoint change, sufficient visual reference existed for the crew to question the aircraft's progress and position, and controversially, that CVR evidence corroborated this belief that the crew had essentially gotten lost and were unsure of their position just prior to impact. For all the reasons just mentioned, this belief didn't sit well with Mahon, and he went to great lengths to debunk both accusations. In light of the visual conditions prevailing at the time, psychologists testified that given the strength of Collins' preconditioning and his belief that the aircraft was actually transiting down the Sound, the visual similarity between entry to both the Sound and Lewis Bay would only have acted to reinforce the crew's existing bias. In other words, although in the wrong place, the world outside looked as they had expected it to, and as such, no suspicions or reservations were raised. In relation to the CVR evidence, specialists in the field were overwhelmingly critical of Chippendale's actions and methodology. In conclusion, much of his interpretation was ultimately undermined, with accusations that he had actually been the victim of his own preconditioning. In believing that Collins had been flying low level and in cloud, he had interpreted what he had heard in that context. In short, he was guilty of having heard what he wanted to hear. But in one regard, Chippendale was correct. Collins had been flying low level at 1,500 feet when supposedly the hard floor for visual operations in the area was 6,000, by agreement between Air New Zealand and the regulator. How had this happened? In Chippendale's mind, this was an act of gross, willful non-compliance. But again, Mahon believed that there was more to the story than met the eye. The history of the various altitude hard floors was well documented. Initially, 16,000 feet had been set as the minimum altitude, a prudent course of action, providing a 3,500 foot buffer above the highest terrain in the area, namely Mt.Erebus itself. As time passed and experience of the route was gained, the airline applied for and received approval to descend to 6,000 feet in order to ensure the best sightseeing experience possible. In an act of justifiable prudence, the descent from 16 to 6 was to be made only after the aircraft had passed to the south of Williams Field, ensuring that the terrain issues had been left behind them to the true north. But sometime after that, things began to change, if not in a policy context, well then most certainly in a behavioural one. Under radar coverage, future trips had descended to altitudes much lower than the stipulated 6,000 minimum, provided that the aircraft was capable of remaining clear of cloud. Indeed, many crew under oath had testified that such practice was condoned during the pre-departure route briefing. The practice was an open secret, with multiple media reports recounting the wondrous majesty of the Antarctic landscape as seen from altitudes as low as 1,000 feet. Air New Zealand took no action to discourage the practice and reportedly claimed to have no knowledge of their crews behaving in such a manner. This despite the significant media coverage and testimony of one of their own management pilots to the fact that he himself had descended below the stipulated 6,000 minima on his trip to the frozen continent. Now for the first time, Mahon found Air New Zealand's evidence to lack credibility. He was clear in his own mind that the company were aware of the unauthorised descents and believed that both they and the regulator had simply chosen to look the other way. In so doing, they had normalised this non-compliance and by their inaction had been seen to condone what was happening on the line. In Mahon's opinion, Colin had been undoubtedly flying below the 6,000 foot hard floor, but not in a reckless manner, and most definitely wasn't the first pilot to do so. The final piece of the puzzle, therefore, was that if all of the above was taken as factual and Collins' descent to 1,500 feet had been made while remaining clear of cloud, with good visibility reported in the McMurdo area, why had none of the 5 people on the flight deck seen the terrain ahead of them before impact? In this regard, Mahon concluded that both Air New Zealand and the Division of Civil Aviation were at fault in failing to educate crew to the optical phenomenon of whiteout. Sure, all were familiar with the concept in the context of blowing loose snow, but all testified of their ignorance to the possibility of whiteout occurrence in good visibility when flying over a uniform white landscape under an overcast cloud-covered layer. Collins and his crew had failed to see Erebus straight in front of them, not because they had negligently flown the aircraft into an area of diminishing visibility. Rather, they had fallen victim to an optical illusion which they had no prior knowledge of. And so Mahon closed the final chapter of Air New Zealand Flight 901, where Chippendale had pointed the finger of blame squarely in Collins' direction. Mahon had proven, without doubt or question from any of the interested parties, that this had not been the case. Fundamentally, he believed that had the flight plan not been amended in the hours prior to Collins' departure, or in amending it the crew had been notified of that fact, the tragedy of Air New Zealand 901 would never have happened. Collins and his crew, however, had been briefed to expect an arrival down the Sound, and explicitly believed that the inherent accuracy of their inertial navigation system would deliver on that task. They had descended in visual conditions, as had many before them, to an altitude well below the 6,000-foot hard floor, but in failing to acquire any visual reference or sign of terrain despite the reported good visibility, prudently had decided to climb away and return to a safer altitude. Collins' decision was prudent, correct, and professional, but time was never on his side. In his report, Mahon concludes as follows. In my opinion, therefore, the single dominant and effective cause of the disaster was the mistake made by those airline officials who programmed the aircraft to fly directly at Mt.Erebus and omitted to tell the aircrew. That mistake is directly attributable not so much to the person who made it, but to the incompetent administrative airline procedures which made the mistake possible. In my opinion, neither Captain Collins, nor First Officer Casson, nor the flight engineers made any error which contributed to the disaster and were not responsible for its occurrence. In most cases, such a comprehensive body of work would have stopped there, with Mahon's conclusions giving pause for thought. But the story of 901 had one final sting in the tail. Such was Mahon's frustration and at times downright anger in relation to Air New Zealand's evidence, that he felt compelled to include the following comments. No judicial officer ever wishes to be compelled to say that he has listened to evidence which is false. He always prefers to say, as I hope the hundreds of judgments which I have written will illustrate, that he cannot accept the relevant explanation, or that he prefers a contrary version set out in the evidence. But in this case, the palpably false sections of evidence which I heard could not have been the result of mistake or faulty recollection. They originated, I am compelled to say, in a predetermined plan of deception. They were very clearly part of an attempt to conceal a series of disastrous administrative blunders, and so, in regard to the particular items of evidence to which I have referred, I am forced reluctantly to say that I had to listen to an orchestrated litany of lies. Air New Zealand's response was immediate and predictably defensive in challenging Mahon's findings of a cover-up. The Court of Appeal found that he had exceeded his authority in making such an accusation, and it was subsequently quashed. Mahon, for his part, took the matter further and appealed to the Privy Council itself, where unfortunately his accusations in relation to the airline were likewise overturned, despite the court readily accepting that his report convincingly cleared the pilots of any wrongdoing. And so, his own career in tatters, Mahon retired from the High Court bench in 1982, in many ways becoming the final victim of the Erebus tragedy. Having passed away in August 1986, in 2008, some 22 years later, He was posthumously awarded the Jim Collins Memorial Award by the New Zealand Pilots Association for his exceptional contribution to air safety, in forever changing the general approach used in transport accident investigations worldwide. With regard, Collins and his crew, their families, friends and colleagues, another 18 years would pass before those in authority would apologise for the untold damage which was done to their good name and reputation. This was the story of Air New Zealand 901, lost on the slopes of Mt.Erebus on the afternoon of November 28, 1979.